Georgia Ralston stood on Grant Carson's porch with the Winchester rifle cradled in both arms like a sleeping child, her knuckles white against the worn wood stock, her jaw set hard as the frozen ground she had crossed to get here. The February wind cut through her wool coat as if the coat were made of nothing, as if she herself were made of nothing, which was precisely how she had felt for the better part of 6 months. She had rehearsed this moment 100 times during the long walk from her homestead, 3 miles of mud and ice and self-recrimination, and in every version of the rehearsal she handed the rifle back, said thank you, and turned around and went home. Simple, clean. No entanglement, no secrets exchanged, no dark past dragged up into the pale winter light. The door opened before she could knock. Grant Carson filled the frame the way he always filled every space he occupied, not with arrogance, not with the swagger she had come to associate with the men who had come west chasing some hungry myth about themselves, but with a stillness that felt almost dangerous, like a river that ran deep and cold and gave nothing away on its surface. He was 34 years old, lean and sun-darkened even in winter, with pale gray eyes that fixed on her and the rifle, and seemed to understand something about both that she had not yet articulated even to herself. He looked at the Winchester for a long moment. He looked at her face. Something shifted in his expression, not quite pain, not quite relief, something caught halfway between, and he said, "Georgia, just her name, nothing else." And somehow that single word undid every careful brick she had mortared into place since she had buried her husband Elias Ralston in the hard ground of October and told herself she was going to be fine. She thrust the rifle toward him. "I came to return it. The hard winter is passing. I have no more need of it." He did not take it. He stood there with his hands loose at his sides and his gray eyes steady on hers, and he said, "Keep it." She blinked. "I beg your pardon. Keep it, Georgia. It is yours." The wind shoved between them like a third person trying to break up a conversation that had barely started. She became suddenly aware that her hair was escaping its pins, that her boots were muddy to the ankle, that she must look exactly like what she was, a widow at the end of her rope, a woman who had borrowed a neighbor's rifle to keep wolves off her remaining livestock through the coldest stretch of winter she had ever survived. A woman who had no idea what she was doing standing on this particular porch in February, holding a gun she had already decided to give back. "That is not what I came here for," she said carefully. "I know it." He opened the door wider. "Come inside. You look half frozen and I have coffee on." "I should not, probably not." He did not move. "Come in anyway." And that was the moment, that impossible, simple, gravity-defying moment when Georgia Ralston understood that she was in genuine trouble. Not the kind of trouble that came with wolves and ice and an empty larder and a dead husband's debts. The other kind. The kind that had no practical solution, no pragmatic exit, no clean transaction to conclude and walk away from. The kind of trouble that started with a man standing in a doorway saying, "Come in anyway," and meaning 1,000 things by it that she was not yet equipped to hear. She went in. To understand how Georgia Ralston came to be standing on Grant Carson's porch in February of 1883 with a borrowed Winchester and a breaking heart, you have to go back to the previous autumn, to the particular afternoon in late September, when everything she had built her life around came apart so fast, she barely had time to register one disaster before the next one arrived. Elias Ralston had been a good man. She believed this in the way she believed in the geography of the land she lived on factually, without much sentimentality, because sentimentality had no practical use on the high plains of southeastern Wyoming Territory. He had been good to her, careful with money, steady in his habits, honest in his dealings, and he had loved her in the quiet, undemonstrative way of men who felt things deeply, but had been taught early that the expression of feeling was a kind of weakness. They had been married 4 years. They had one son, Thomas, who was 3 and had his father's eyes and his mother's stubborn mouth. The day Elias died, he had gone out to check on the northern fence line, and his horse had come back without him. That was all. She had ridden out herself in the gathering dusk, Thomas bundled against her back and found Elias at the bottom of a shallow ravine. His horse had thrown him. He had hit his head on the limestone outcropping. The doctor from Laramie, who arrived 2 days later, confirmed that death had been quick. Georgia told herself this was a mercy. She told herself a great many things in those first weeks that she did not entirely believe. The debts were worse than she had known. Not ruinous, but close. Elias had borrowed against the ranch to buy the additional cattle he had planned to run through the summer. And the summer had been a hard one with less grass than expected. And 24 head had been sold at a poor price to cover the most pressing note. What remained was a modest herd, a solid house, 40 acres of decent range, a 3-year-old boy, and a woman who had no family within 500 miles, and who was not entirely sure she knew how to do what needed to be done next. She knew her nearest neighbor was Grant Carson. She knew this in the abstract, factual way she knew most things about the surrounding country. He was 2 miles south by the creek. He ran a cattle operation of reasonable size. He had a reputation for being fair-dealing and private, and she had spoken to him perhaps 6 or 7 times in the 4 years she had lived there, mostly at the general store in Dunmore, the small town 8 miles east, and once at a barn raising for the Hendersons when she had noticed that he worked harder than anyone else present and accepted no thanks for it. Elias had said he was a good man. Elias had said he was the kind of man you wanted as a neighbor, which in the language of the High Plains was as close to a tribute as most men ever got. In October, 3 weeks after Elias died, Grant Carson rode up to her house on a Tuesday morning with a quarter of beef wrapped in cloth and tied to his saddle. He knocked. He took off his hat when she opened the door. He said he was sorry about her husband, said it simply, and without any of the awful performative grief she had been receiving from the other neighbors, the kind of grief that was really about the discomfort of the living in the presence of loss. He said he had more beef than he needed and thought she could use it. He said if she needed anything over the winter she should not hesitate to send word. She took the beef. She said thank you. She watched him ride back south, and she stood in her doorway for a long time after he disappeared, aware of something she could not name but that felt uncomfortably like the first clear sensation she had experienced since the horse came back without Elias. She did not send word. October passed. November arrived with an early cold that felt like a warning, and the warning proved accurate because by December the snow was coming in ways she had not seen before, not the steady, manageable snowfall of previous winters, but the lateral, screaming kind that turned the air solid white and buried the fences, and made the world outside her window into something alien and hostile. The cattle she still had were penned in the barn, and she was burning through her hay stores faster than she had planned. Thomas had a cough that scared her. Her woodpile was adequate but not generous. And in the second week of December she was awakened at 3 in the morning by the sound of something worrying her remaining chickens, and she went to the window and saw, in the moonlight that came off the snow, 2 wolves at the door of her chicken coop. She had no rifle. Elias had taken his to be repaired in September, and it had not yet been returned from the gunsmith in Laramie, and she had not thought about it because in September she had not imagined that October would take everything. She stood at the window in her nightgown with Thomas asleep in the next room, and she watched the wolves, and she thought, with a clarity that was almost peaceful, that she needed a gun. The next morning she bundled Thomas up, hitched the horse to the small sleigh Elias had built the previous winter, and drove south through the snow to Grant Carson's place. He was in his barn when she arrived. He heard the sleigh and came to the barn door, and she watched his face go through several things in rapid succession when he saw her: surprise, concern, and something else she filed away without examining. She explained the situation plainly. She had lost 4 chickens, and she needed to borrow a rifle until she could either get to town or get Elias' gun back from the gunsmith. He went inside and came back with the Winchester and a box of shells. He handed them to her. He said, "Georgia, if things get tight this winter, I need you to tell me." Not in a way that suggested obligation or charity or pity. In a way that suggested the plain truth of a neighbor speaking to a neighbor in a territory where the land itself was the enemy half the year, and the only thing standing between survival and catastrophe was the willingness of people to act on each other's behalf. She said she would. She drove home. She killed one of the wolves that night, and the other did not come back. The winter deepened. She managed. She was good at managing. It was perhaps her defining characteristic, the one her mother had identified early, and her father had relied on too heavily, and Elias had loved about her in the way you could love a quality in a person without ever quite seeing the cost of it to them. She managed the cattle and the hay and the firewood and the sick calf and Thomas's cough and the loneliness that settled into the house at night like a fifth wall, cold and load-bearing. She did not send word to Grant Carson, because she had said she would not hesitate, and she was hesitating, and she knew she was hesitating, and she understood why she was hesitating, and she did not wish to examine the reason too closely. He came anyway, not intrusively, not in a way she could reasonably object to. He showed up on a Thursday morning in mid-January with a load of hay on his wagon, said he had surplus, and it would go to waste if he left it. And she did not protest because her own supply was down to a thin margin, and she had been doing the mathematics every morning with a sinking feeling in her stomach. He unloaded the hay into her barn. He checked her cattle without being asked and identified a heifer with a respiratory infection that she had not noticed because she had been so focused on Thomas, who had been running a low fever for 3 days. He told her what to do for the heifer. He drank the coffee she offered him, sitting at her kitchen table with his hat on his knee, and they talked for the better part of an hour about practical things: the hay market, the condition of the roads, the likelihood of the hard weather breaking before March, and the conversation was easy in a way that surprised her, easy in the way of two people who had been occupying the same range of emotional territory without knowing the other person was there. He left before noon. He did not overstay. He did not make anything of having come. He treated it as the completely unremarkable act it objectively was, and she found herself standing at her window watching his wagon go north up the road and feeling something she recognized, with considerable alarm as longing. She filed it away. She was good at filing things away. He came back 2 more times in January, each time with some plausible practical reason. The second time he brought medicine for Thomas, proper medicine, from the doctor in Laramie, and she did not ask how he had gotten it or how he had known Thomas was still unwell, because she was fairly certain she did not want to know the answer, which was that he had been paying attention in ways that were beginning to mean something to her that frightened her considerably. The third time he came, he stayed longer. There was a storm building, and he could not reasonably leave before it passed. She made supper. Thomas, recovered now and full of the irrepressible energy of 3-year-olds, attached himself to Grant with the unself-conscious trust of a child who has not yet learned to be guarded. He made Grant read him a story from the worn picture book that Elias had bought in Cheyenne, a book about a bear who got lost and found his way home, and Grant read it with the kind of patient attention that suggested he was not entirely uncomfortable with children, which Georgia noted and filed away with all the other things she was filing away in the increasingly crowded interior space she had set aside for observations about Grant Carson that she was not ready to do anything with. After Thomas was in bed, they sat by the fire, and the storm hammered the outside of the house, and they talked. Not about practical things this time. She had drunk 2 cups of coffee, and he had declined a third, and the fire was low, and she did not know entirely how it happened, but they were talking about Elias. She was talking about Elias, about what he had been like, about the particular shape his absence had cut out of her daily life, about the strange guilt of being relieved on certain days that at least she only had herself and Thomas to answer for now, because Elias had needed things from her, quiet things, invisible things, the constant low-level emotional tending that she had given without complaint because she had loved him, and because she was good at giving things without complaint. Grant listened. He did not offer platitudes. He did not tell her what she felt or how she should feel or when she should feel differently. He sat with his coffee cup on his knee and his eyes on the fire, and he listened. And at the end of it she felt lighter in a way she had not felt since October. And she thought, this is dangerous. This is the most dangerous thing that has happened to me all winter, and she was right. He left when the storm broke at midnight, and she stood at her door watching his lantern move away through the snow, and she knew, with the same clarity with which she had made every important decision of her life, that she was in trouble. February came and the hard winter began to loosen its grip, tentatively, the way a fist unclenches when the danger has passed. The worst was over. The cattle had come through better than she had feared. The hay Grant had brought her had made the difference. Thomas was healthy. The sky was doing something different in the mornings now, something that promised, cautiously, that March was coming. She got the Winchester down from the hook by the door where it had hung for 2 months, and she cleaned it, same as she would have cleaned anything borrowed, and she thought about what it meant to take it back. She thought about what it meant to stand on Grant Carson's porch and complete the transaction. She thought about the way he had looked at her on those January visits, not in the way Elias had looked at her. Elias had looked at her with a kind of grateful possessiveness, a way of seeing her that was warm but that did not quite see all of her, but in a different way, a way that saw more than she wanted seen, and that did not look away when she looked back, that met her eyes and held there with that still, deep river patience that was either the most reassuring or the most terrifying quality she had ever encountered in another person, depending on the day. She walked 3 miles through the mud and ice of early February, and she stood on his porch and held out the rifle. He said, "Keep it." She went inside. His kitchen was warm and smelled of coffee and wood smoke and something else, something she associated now specifically with this house and this man, something she could not have described accurately but that felt uncomfortably like the olfactory equivalent of the word home. She sat at his table and he poured coffee and set it in front of her and sat across from her, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "Where's Thomas?" he asked. "With Mabel Henderson." "I told her I had an errand in town." She looked at her coffee. "I lied. I came here instead." He was quiet for a moment. "Why did you say you were going to town?" "Because I did not want anyone asking me why I was coming to your place." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside the wind was still moving, but it had dropped from its earlier ferocity, and the silence between them had a different quality now, a heavier quality, a quality of things that had been accumulating unsaid for months pressing against the air. "Georgia," he said, "do not." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Do not say something that you will need to take back, or that I will need to pretend I did not hear." "I was not going to say anything that needed taking back." She looked at him then. He was looking back at her with those pale gray eyes that gave nothing away except everything, and she felt the familiar internal alarm that she associated with Grant Carson sounding clearly and uselessly in her chest. "You have been very kind to me this winter," she said. "I have been your neighbor. It was more than that, and you know it." He did not deny it. He put his hands flat on the table and looked at them and then looked back at her. "You have been widowed 6 months. I did not want to make anything harder for you." "You have not," she swallowed. "You have made things considerably easier, which is its own kind of hard." Something moved across his face, not quite a smile, not quite pain, something that combined elements of both. "I know. You have a dark past," she said, surprising herself. She had heard things, the kind of things that move through small communities like weather, fragmentary and not entirely reliable. A life before Wyoming, something in Texas, a marriage maybe or nearly a marriage that had ended badly. He was very still. "Who told you?" "No one told me anything specific, only impressions." "You do not have to tell me." "No." He pushed back from the table slightly but did not stand. "You should know. If we are going to be whatever we are going to be, you should know." He looked at the window. "I was married 8 years ago in Abilene. Her name was Ruth." He stopped. Georgia waited. She died of fever the second year. She was 23. His voice was completely level, which meant nothing because she had learned that Grant Carson's voice was always level. The level was not evidence of absence of feeling. It was evidence of tremendous restraint. I came out here afterward because I needed to be somewhere that did not know me. I am sorry, Georgia said. And she was deeply, not in the performative way she had become familiar with from others in her direction, but in the genuine way of one person recognizing the particular shape of another person's loss because she knew the shape of her own. 8 years is a long time, he said. I do not tell you that to minimize what you are feeling now. I only mean, he stopped again, started over. I have not wanted anyone in 8 years. I have not looked at another woman and thought anything of it. Until he looked at her directly. Until you drove your sleigh down my road in December with your boy on the seat beside you and your jaw set and your eyes forward, and you asked to borrow my rifle like you were asking for nothing more significant than a cup of sugar, and I thought. He stopped. What did you think? Her voice was barely above a whisper. I thought, there is the most remarkable woman I have ever seen in my life. The kitchen was very quiet. Georgia looked at her coffee cup. She looked at her hands. She looked at the window where the Wyoming February was carrying on with its indifferent beauty. She thought about Elias. She thought about the particular kind of loneliness that had settled into her bones in the 6 months since October. Not just the loneliness of a missing husband, but the deeper, older loneliness of a woman who had never been entirely seen, who had been valued enormously for what she could do, and not quite enough for what she was. She thought about Thomas, sleeping in Mabel Henderson's spare room, and what she owed him and what she owed herself, and whether those two obligations were in the conflict she had been assuming they were. She said, Grant. He said, yes. I am not entirely sure what I am doing. Neither am I, he said. I have not been entirely sure what I was doing since December, a beat. I am fairly certain I would like to keep doing it, whatever it is. She laughed. It came out before she could stop it, a real laugh, the kind she had not produced in 6 months, and she pressed her fingers against her mouth afterward as if she could put it back, and he was looking at her with an expression that was unmistakably, irrevocably tender. I live 3 miles from you, she said, 2.5. I have a son. I know. I have debts. I know. I am not, she stopped. I am not someone who takes things lightly. If we are going to, if this is, I need you to understand that I cannot do this lightly. I cannot have you come and then have you be done with it. I cannot afford that. Thomas cannot afford that. Georgia. He said her name in the same way he had said it in the doorway, with that terrible simplicity. I am not a man who does things lightly. You know that about me already. She did. That was, in some essential way, the entirety of her problem. She drove home from Grant Carson's house that afternoon with the Winchester still in her possession, the rifle he had told her to keep, and something else he had given her that she had not brought to the table and could not have named, but that she carried all the way home through the muddy February roads, careful with it, the way you were careful with something that had the potential to be either the most important thing you had ever been handed or the thing that broke you when you dropped it. She collected Thomas from Mabel Henderson's, accepted Mabel's sharp-eyed assessment of her altered state with as much composure as she could manage, and drove home in the weakening afternoon light with her boy chattering beside her about the Hendersons' dog and the biscuits Mabel had made, and whether bears really did get lost the way the book said. And she listened to him with her whole attention and felt, underneath the complexity of everything she was feeling about Grant Carson, a simple and foundational love for this child that organized all the other feelings around it, the way a spine organizes a body. She made supper. She put Thomas to bed. She sat by her fire with her hands in her lap, and she thought, very carefully, about all the ways this could go wrong. She was good at that. She had always been good at imagining the ways things could go wrong, which was partly what made her so effective at preventing them. But she was also, she admitted this to herself now, in the firelight in the quiet house, she was also tired. She was tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hard winter or the physical labor of running a ranch alone, or the exhausting logistics of managing everything that Elias had left behind. She was tired in the way of a person who had been holding themselves together through an act of sustained will for so long that the will itself was beginning to fray at the edges. She was tired of being only capable. She was tired of being only practical. She was tired of the inside of her chest feeling like an empty room that someone had forgotten to furnish. She thought about the way Grant had looked at her in his kitchen. She thought about what he had said about Ruth, about the careful, painful honesty of it, about the 8 years he had carried that loss and still come out the other side of it capable of looking at a woman and thinking something of it. She thought about the way he sat with Thomas, the patient, comfortable way, as if the child's presence was simply pleasant rather than a complication to be managed. She went to bed. She slept better than she had in months. March came, and with it the actual loosening of winter's grip, the mud season, messy and promising, the first actual warmth in the afternoon sun, the cattle moving more freely, the land showing green in patches where the snow had pulled back. Georgia threw herself into the work of it, the fence repairs and the herd assessment and the hay order and the 1,000 small urgencies of a ranch coming back to life after winter. And she told herself she was simply busy, which was true, and she told herself that was why she was not thinking about Grant Carson, which was not. He appeared on a Saturday morning in the second week of March with a fence post driver and 2 hours of work, and the information that her north fence had a section down near the creek that he had noticed while checking his own cattle. She stood and watched him work for approximately 3 minutes before taking up her own tools and working alongside him, because she was not a woman who stood and watched people work. He seemed to have expected this. They worked the section together without much talking, in the efficient, comfortable way of 2 people who had learned each other's rhythms without quite realizing it. When the fence was done, they stood at the creek and looked at the water running high with snowmelt, brown and purposeful and cold, and she said, "Grant, I have been thinking." "So have I," he said. I think I would like to continue, whatever this is." She squared her jaw the way she did when she said things that cost her something. I cannot make any promises about what this becomes, but I think I would like to find out." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the creek. Then he said, "Georgia, I would be honored." It was not the kind of thing most men in Wyoming Territory said. Most men in Wyoming Territory did not use the word honored in reference to personal matters. The word sat in the air between them, and she felt it in her chest like a struck bell. "Also," he said, and now there was something in his voice that was lighter, almost cautious, "Thomas told me last time I came that I was his second best friend after the Henderson dog, and I thought that was a reasonably strong start." She laughed again, the real laugh, and this time she did not try to put it back. They spent the spring finding their way toward each other with the careful attention of 2 people who had both been hurt, and who had both learned that care taken at the beginning was not timidity, but wisdom. He came to her place twice a week, sometimes 3 times, always with a practical reason that became less important than the real reason as the weeks went on. She went to his place on Sunday afternoons with Thomas, and those visits had a domestic quality that she felt in her bones. Thomas running through Grant's yard after his dog, a brown cattle dog named Pepper who had accepted the boy with magnificent indifference that Thomas interpreted as love, and Georgia in Grant's kitchen making coffee or sometimes supper, while Grant worked at the table with the account books he always seemed to be wrestling with, and the particular warmth of those hours. The ordinary, extraordinary warmth of them was something she had not experienced before, and that she found herself thinking about during the week in the way you thought about something that was both a comfort and a kind of grief, because it reminded you of what you had been going without. He kissed her for the first time in April. They were standing on her porch in the evening after he had helped her move a sick cow into the small pen near the barn, and the sun was going down in the enormous Wyoming way, the sky doing its dramatic best with orange and purple, and a particular shade of rose that seemed unnecessary in its beauty. And she was tired and had hay in her hair and her hands were not clean. And he reached out and tucked a loose strand of hair back from her face with 2 fingers, and then stood there with his hand barely touching her cheek, and they looked at each other for a long moment. And then he kissed her, gently, briefly, and stepped back. She put her hand flat on his chest. She could feel his heart through his shirt. "Grant," she said. "I know," he said. "I know the timing, I know everything." "It is not," she kept her hand on his chest. "It is not the timing. The timing is a real consideration, but it is not what I was going to say." "What were you going to say?" She looked at him carefully. "I was going to say that I am not frightened of this, which surprises me. I thought I would be frightened." The expression on his face was very quiet and very complicated. "Are you sure?" "I am not entirely sure of anything," she said honestly, "but I am sure of that part." He kissed her again, less briefly this time, and she thought, with the part of her mind that continued to function as an observer even in the most intense moments, that she had been right about the danger, and also that the danger had been exactly worth it. April gave way to May. The range was green and the cattle were well, and the days were long enough now to hold work until 7 in the evening, and Georgia's ranch was showing signs of real health for the first time since Elias died, partly her own work, partly the hay and the heifer medicine and the fence repair, and the 100 invisible contributions Grant had made through the winter and spring that she was going to sit down and reckon with properly, because she did not want to be a woman who took without accounting. But partly also something less tangible, the specific kind of renewed energy that comes to a person when they have stopped using all their available resources on simply continuing to exist. She still had the rifle. She had mentioned returning it twice more, and both times Grant had refused with the same quiet absoluteness. She had come to understand that the rifle was not really about the rifle. It was about that first morning in December when she had driven her sleigh through the snow with Thomas beside her and asked for help, the moment when the self-sufficiency that she had worn like armor all her life had cracked slightly, just enough to let something in. The rifle was the physical fact of that moment. Grant keeping it with her was his way of saying the crack was not a weakness. It was the right kind of opening. In June, Grant Carson did something that surprised her. He showed up on a Wednesday morning, not with tools or cattle medicine or practical purpose, but with a small wildflower he had picked somewhere on the road between his place and hers, a yellow thing she could not identify, pressed somewhat flat from being in his shirt pocket, and he gave it to her without saying anything and looked simultaneously uncomfortable and determined in a way she found so endearing that she had to look away to keep her composure. "What is this?" she asked. "A flower," he said. "Obviously, I can see that. I have been told," he said stiffly, "that people sometimes give flowers to indicate their regard." She pressed her lips together very hard. "Told you that, Mrs. Henderson at the store, when I asked her what was appropriate." He looked pained. "She told everyone in the store. Old Jim Carver congratulated me before I got to the door." She gave up and laughed. He looked at her with that expression that was not quite a smile but that contained, she had come to understand, everything a smile meant. "Grant Carson," she said, "you are the most sincere man I have ever known in my life." "That is either a compliment or a warning," he said. "Both," she said, and she stood on her toes and kissed him in the doorway of her house in the June morning light with the yellow flower still in her hand. He asked her to marry him in July. He did not do it dramatically. He did not do it on a knee or with a prepared speech, which she would have found unsettling and out of character. He did it on a Sunday afternoon when Thomas was asleep in the shade of the cottonwood with Pepper curled at his feet, and the summer was warm and drowsy around them, and they were sitting on the fence looking out at the range. He said in his level, unornamented way, "Georgia, I would like us to be married, if you are willing." She did not answer immediately. She sat on the fence and looked at the range and thought about it with the full attention she gave to every important decision. She thought about Elias. She thought about the 4 years of her first marriage, the good, solid, honest years of it, and the things that had been good and the things that had been quietly insufficient, the particular loneliness of being in a partnership with a person who loved you but could not quite reach all the way to the center of you. She thought about what it meant to choose again. She thought about what it meant to choose this. She thought about Grant the December morning, and the hay and the medicine and the fence and the flower, and the way he read Thomas's book with patient attention, and the way he had told her about Ruth with no self-pity and no drama, and the way he looked at her that saw all of her, the capable parts and the hidden parts and the tired parts and the laughing parts and the parts that were still, 6 months after Elias died, learning what they were without Elias. She thought about the way she felt in his kitchen on Sunday afternoons, the specific warmth of it, the thing she had called home in her own mind and then been frightened by calling it that. She said, "Yes." He turned to look at her. "Yes." I said, "Yes, Grant." A long pause. "Good," he said with such enormous, barely controlled relief that she burst out laughing, and then he laughed too, the real laugh that she had only heard a handful of times, and that transformed his face entirely. And Thomas woke up at the sound of it and looked at them both with the serious, approving curiosity of 3-year-olds, and Pepper thumped her tail in the dust. They were married in September of 1883, 1 year almost exactly after Elias Ralston had ridden out to check his north fence line and not come back. The ceremony was in Dunmore, in the small white church that served the county, with the Hendersons and the Carvers and a dozen other neighbors, and Mrs. Henderson cried and old Jim Carver shook Grant's hand for a considerable time. Thomas wore a shirt Georgia had made him from fabric she had ordered from the catalog in Cheyenne, a serious dark blue that he wore with great solemnity. He stood beside Grant during the ceremony holding Pepper on a rope lead because he had refused to leave the dog outside, and Grant had said that was fine with him. The minister said the words. Grant said his. Georgia said hers. They were not elaborate words. They were the plain words of the ceremony spoken with the seriousness they deserved. Outside the church in the September sunshine, Mabel Henderson took Georgia's arm and said, under the noise of the gathered neighbors, "You look different, Georgia. You look settled." "I feel it," Georgia said, and she did. Not the settled of someone who had accepted a compromise, not the settled of someone who had done the practical thing, but the settled of someone who had found, by a route she would not have predicted, the specific place where she was meant to be. They moved her things to Grant's ranch, the larger of the two operations, and the one with the bigger house, which had felt echoingly empty when Georgia first walked through it, and which began to feel like something else as soon as she began to inhabit it. The rifle went on the hook by the door of Grant's house, which was now Georgia's house too. Grant did not comment on this. Georgia looked at it one afternoon and thought that there was something right about where it was hanging. The two ranches were now one, which solved Georgia's debt problem efficiently and permanently, and which doubled Grant's operation in ways that his careful account books suggested were extremely positive. They spent the fall of 1883 in a state of organized industry that was also, unmistakably, happiness. The particular happiness of two self-sufficient people who had discovered that collaboration was not a diminishment of their individual capabilities, but a multiplication of them. Thomas adapted to the new arrangement with the flexibility of children who are loved and feel it. He called Grant by his first name for the first month, then by a word that was not quite Grant and not quite father but something of his own invention that he used with proprietary certainty, and that made Grant very still the first time he heard it in a way that Georgia noticed and did not comment on because some things did not require comment. They were happy. That is a simple thing to say but a complex thing to be, and Georgia knew the difference. She had not been unhappy with Elias. But happiness, she was discovering, was not simply the absence of unhappiness. It was this, the evenings by the fire, the mornings where they woke together and lay for a few minutes before the day's work started, the meals they made together with Thomas underfoot, the conversations that were sometimes about practical things and sometimes about everything else, the physical warmth of a person beside her who was fully there, who was not somewhere else while appearing to be present, who looked at her and saw her and said so. Grant was not a demonstrative man by temperament, but he was attentive in ways that mattered more than demonstration. He knew when she was tired before she said so. He knew when she was worried and did not press her but stayed close. He brought her coffee in the morning before she asked for it. He read to Thomas without being asked. He touched her hair sometimes with the same two-finger gesture he had used on her porch in April, a gesture that had become, in the language they were building between them, an entire sentence. She told him once, on a winter evening when Thomas was in bed, and the fire was low and they were sitting together in the particular quiet of a house that felt inhabited rather than empty, that she had not expected this. "Expected what?" he said. "This." She gestured vaguely at the room, at him, at the space between them that was no longer a space in any meaningful sense. "I expected to survive. I expected to do reasonably well. I had not expected to feel." She stopped. "What?" he asked quietly. "Full," she said. "I had not expected to feel full." He looked at her for a long moment. He reached over and put his hand over hers on the arm of the chair. He said, "Neither had I. The winter of 1883 to 1884 was milder than the previous year, which the ranching community received with collective relief. Georgia and Grant's combined operation came through it in excellent condition. Their hay stores were more than adequate, their cattle were strong, and by February Georgia was keeping a secret she had not yet found the words to tell, a secret that made her sit sometimes in the morning with her coffee and look at the light coming through the kitchen window with a complicated mixture of wonder and terror that she thought she probably should not be alone with. She told Grant on a Wednesday evening. She said it plainly because she did not know how to say it any other way. "I am going to have a child." He was at the table with the account books. He went very still. He put down his pen. He looked at her. "When?" "August, I think." She looked at him carefully. Is this?" He was up from his chair before she finished the question, and she was in his arms in the way she had learned to inhabit being in his arms, without the stiffness that had characterized her first months with him, when being held had felt simultaneously wonderful and frightening, but with the ease of a person who had learned that this specific harbor was safe. He said nothing for a moment. When he stepped back his eyes were very bright. "A boy, I think," he said. "You cannot know that." "No. I suppose I think a boy because Thomas needs a brother to boss around." She laughed. "He does considerable bossing already. I am not sure the addition of a victim will improve matters." Their son was born in late August of 1884, a healthy, loud, demanding baby that Grant delivered himself with the assistance of Mrs. Henderson, who arrived barely in time, and who said afterwards that she had never seen a man as calm as Grant Carson at the moment of his child coming into the world, and that she thought this said everything about the kind of man he was. They named him James after Grant's father, a man who had died before Grant came to Wyoming, and whom Georgia knew only through the few stories Grant told on winter evenings, careful stories, told with love and economy. Thomas received his brother with the magnificently complicated feelings of 4-year-olds presented with competition. He was grave and suspicious for the first week, then protective, then slowly, inevitably, in the way of older children throughout human history, devoted. He brought James rocks from the yard with explanatory commentary. He stood at the crib and delivered serious monologues. He informed Pepper that the dog was now responsible for the baby's safety, which Pepper took on with what appeared to be genuine commitment. The ranch grew. The operation that Grant and Georgia ran together was, by 1885, one of the more solid middle-sized ranches in that part of Wyoming Territory. Not the largest, not ostentatious, but well-managed and financially stable in a territory, and a time where stability was not guaranteed by any means. They hired a hand named Pedro, a quiet man from New Mexico Territory with an encyclopedic knowledge of cattle, and a fondness for Thomas that expressed itself as teaching the boy to whittle. A skilled Georgia observed with mixed feelings about the resulting quantities of small wooden objects that began accumulating on every horizontal surface in the house. Life had a texture now that Georgia had not known how to wish for before she had it. It was not a smooth texture. The ranch was hard work. The territory was hard country. There were bad years and good years and years that contained both, the way all years do when you are paying attention to them honestly. There were arguments, real arguments, the kind that happen between people who both have strong opinions and the willingness to defend them, who are both capable and used to their own judgment, and who had each spent years being entirely responsible for themselves and their decisions. Grant's stubbornness on certain matters was legendary in a household of 2 adults and eventually 3 children. Georgia's refusal to admit she needed help before the situation became critical was a recurring source of exasperation for a man who had spent the previous 3 years trying to teach her, by example, that asking for help was not the same as failing. They had a 3rd child in 1887, a daughter this time, born at the beginning of March in the particular tender season, when winter was releasing its grip and everything in the world was cautiously beginning again. They named her Ruth, after the woman Grant had loved and lost in Abilene, and Georgia had been the one to suggest it, which had made him look at her in a way that contained no words and did not need any. Ruth was dark-haired where the boys were lighter, and she had Grant's gray eyes and a face that was otherwise entirely Georgia's, and she was by disposition the most determined person in a household of determined people, which was saying something considerable. Thomas adored her with the uncomplicated worship of older siblings. James regarded her initial helplessness with scientific skepticism that gradually gave way to the same devotion that Thomas showed, slightly more embarrassed about it. Georgia stood one evening in the spring of 1888 on the porch of the house that had once felt too large and now felt perfectly inhabited, watching Grant come up from the barn with Thomas at his side. Thomas was 8 now, serious and helpful, carrying himself with a gravity that made her think sometimes of Elias and sometimes of Grant and sometimes of no one at all but himself, which seemed right, and James, 4 years old and constitutionally incapable of walking anywhere he could run, careening around the yard with Pepper lumbering after him, Pepper being 11 years old now and somewhat less nimble, but committed to her duty with the persistence of the very loyal. Ruth was in Georgia's arms, 18 months old and regarding the world from this vantage point, with the critical attention of someone who has not yet decided whether to approve of it. Georgia watched Grant say something to Thomas that made the boy grin, genuinely grin, the open, unguarded grin of a child who feels entirely safe, and she felt something in her chest that was by now familiar but that had never become unremarkable, a warmth, a completeness, a feeling of having arrived somewhere that she had not known was the destination until she was there. Grant looked up from the barn and saw her on the porch and stopped walking for just a moment. 8 years of marriage, and he still sometimes stopped walking when he saw her, a tiny pause, barely perceptible, that she had learned to read as the equivalent of everything he did not say because words were not his first language but meaning was. She raised her free hand. He raised his. Thomas looked between them with the resigned expression of an 8-year-old who had grown accustomed to his parents being, in his estimation, extremely obvious about things, and went to see if Pedro had finished the small barn he had promised him. In the evenings, after the children were in bed and the house settled into its night sounds, Grant and Georgia had a habit of sitting on the porch in the good seasons, side by side in the 2 chairs that had replaced the single original porch chair sometime in the first winter of their marriage. The Wyoming sky at night was extravagant, not in a way that required comment, because you could not comment on something that large and do it justice, but in a way that had a physical effect, that made the chest expand slightly, that made the particular scale of human concerns feel properly calibrated against the vastness of things. On a September evening in 1888, 5 years after they had been married in the small white church in Dunmore, they sat in their porch chairs and watched the sky do its extravagant best, and Grant said, without any particular preamble, "Georgia." "Yes," she said. "Do you remember the morning you came to borrow the rifle?" She looked at him. "Yes. I have thought about that morning a considerable number of times. What do you think about it?" He was quiet for a moment, looking at the sky. "I think that most of the important things in my life arrived without warning. Ruth died without warning. I left Texas without warning. And then you drove your sleigh down my road on a December morning like you owned the road, with your jaw set and your boy beside you and your hand out for a rifle like it was nothing, and I thought—" He stopped. "What?" "I thought, this is it. This is the thing. Whatever I have been doing here for 8 years, this is why." He looked at her. I know it sounds like too much to think about a stranger asking to borrow a gun." "No," she said quietly. "It does not sound like too much. I want you to know," he said, "that every single day since that morning it has been more than I deserved. I want you to know that I know that." Georgia looked at him for a long time. The porch creaked slightly in the evening wind. Inside the house, one of the children shifted in sleep and was quiet again. "Grant Carson," she said, "you are the most sincere man in Wyoming Territory. You have said that before. I will probably say it again." She reached over and put her hand over his on the arm of his chair, the mirror of what he had done to her on a winter evening 5 years ago. "I want you to know something too." "What?" "The hard winter was the worst thing that happened to me. And it was also," she said, carefully, accurately, "the beginning of the best thing." She turned to look at him fully. "I came to return a rifle and you told me to keep it. You said more than that. You said, without using the words, because you never use the words when you can avoid it, you said that I was worth keeping close. That whatever I had brought to your door, including all the difficult parts, was worth something to you." Her voice was steady, the same deliberate steadiness she used when she said things that cost her. "I had not been told that in those terms before. I want you to know what it meant to me." "What it means." Grant was very still beside her. The stars were doing something exceptional overhead. After a moment he turned his hand over under hers and held it. "Georgia," he said. "Yes. I would like to go on telling you that for a very long time." "Good," she said. "I would like to go on hearing it." They sat in the dark and the stars wheeled slowly overhead, and the cattle moved quietly in the distance, and the house behind them breathed with the sleep of 3 children and the life they had built by the improbable, unlikely, entirely logical route of a hard winter and a borrowed rifle and a man who stood in his doorway in February and said come in anyway and meant everything by it. The rifle still hung on the hook by the door. It would stay there. Georgia had understood for a long time that it was not hers to return, not because Grant had said so, though he had, but because it had become something else. It had become the way certain objects become, in the accumulation of a life together, the physical fact of a story. It was the beginning of the story. It hung there as witness to the December morning, to the hard winter, to the 2 people who had found each other across 3 miles of snow and mud and careful, frightened, necessary hope. By 1890, Wyoming was a state, and the territory they had lived in and worked in and built their lives in was something official and named on maps in a new way, though the land itself had not changed, and the sky was still the same enormous sky, and the work was still the work. Thomas was 10 and serious, and already showed a talent for the cattle management that made Grant watch him with a quiet pride that he expressed by teaching the boy everything he knew, which was the Grant Carson equivalent of effusive praise. James was 6 and had discovered books with an enthusiasm that suggested he might, despite all reasonable expectations, become a reader rather than a cattleman, which Georgia encouraged with the firm conviction that a love of reading was a gift and not a liability. Ruth was 3 and a force of nature. They added a room to the house in the spring of 1890, because the 3 children had outgrown the existing arrangement, and because Georgia had been doing the accounting of available space with the precision she brought to all logistical problems, and had concluded that the expansion was necessary and financially feasible. Grant built it himself, with Thomas helping in the afternoons after his chores, and Georgia brought them coffee in the evenings and stood in the framed-out doorway of the new room and felt the particular satisfaction of a house that was growing because it was loved, because it contained more life than it had been built for, which was the right kind of problem to have. In the summer of 1891, Georgia told Grant she was expecting again. He received this information standing in the kitchen with his coffee, and he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "4," as if he were checking arithmetic. "4," she confirmed. He put down his coffee and came and put his arms around her from behind, his chin on her shoulder, looking out the kitchen window at the summer morning. He said quietly against her hair, "Georgia Ralston." "Georgia Carson," she corrected. "Georgia Carson." He said it like it was still, after 8 years, a remarkable fact. "I would like to say something." "Say it." "I am the luckiest man in the Wyoming state," he said. She turned in his arms and looked at him. "That is a very large claim." "I stand by it." She kissed him in the kitchen in the summer morning light, with Thomas and James making noise in the yard outside, and Ruth's voice coming from somewhere in the house expressing an opinion about something with her characteristic conviction, and the coffee going cold on the counter, and the Wyoming summer coming through the window bright and warm and entirely present. The fourth child was born in February of 1892, a boy, and Grant said the word February with a complicated expression when the doctor confirmed the due date, as if the month carried particular significance for him, which it did. He was born on a Thursday morning and was red-faced and furious about it, in the way of newborns who have been evicted from a comfortable situation and have opinions about it. They named him William, after Georgia's father, a man she had loved and missed and thought about often in the particular way you thought about people who shaped the person you had become. Thomas, 12 years old and mortifyingly dignified about most things, held his new brother with an expression of such concentrated care that Georgia had to look away. James, 7, announced that he would teach William to read as soon as possible, which was ambitious but consistent with his general approach to the world. Ruth, 4, regarded the baby with the calm assessment of someone who has already identified a potential ally. The winter of 1892 was cold, and the winter of 1893 was colder, and the winters continued to be Wyoming winters, which is to say they were serious about themselves and required taking seriously. But Georgia and Grant's ranch was well established by then, with good hay stores always and sound cattle management, and a network of neighboring relationships built on years of the kind of reciprocal good faith that made communities function in hard country. They helped where they could and were helped when they needed it, and the balance felt right. There were the ordinary difficulties of the years. A cattle disease in the spring of 1893 that they managed to contain with the help of a veterinarian from Laramie and a great deal of vigilance. A financial tightening in 1894 that required careful management, but did not threaten the essential soundness of the operation. Thomas, at 15, going through a period of adolescent difficulty that Grant navigated with a patience Georgia observed with something close to awe, the patience of a man who had waited 8 years in an empty house and knew, therefore, what patience actually was. James's commitment to books resolving itself into a correspondence with the school in Laramie about attending the following year, which Georgia supported and Grant supported, and which required adjustments to the family's finances that they made without drama. Through all of it, the rifle hung on the hook by the door. Neighbors who came to the house saw it and knew the story, the way stories circulated in small communities where everyone's business was partially everyone's business. Old Jim Carver, who had congratulated Grant in the store when he bought the flour, said once over supper that it was the most useful rifle in Wyoming because it had never had to be fired in any emergency greater than a wolf, and had done more good just by hanging on that hook than most weapons did by being fired. Georgia had laughed. Grant had smiled the almost smile. In 1895, James went to Laramie for school, and the house was both quieter and fuller in the way houses become when a child is absent, and you become suddenly aware of the specific shape of their presence. He wrote letters regularly, good letters, letters that showed the mind Georgia had watched developing since he was old enough to hold a book, and Grant read them at the table in the evenings with an expression that contained, Georgia had learned to read, everything that simpler men would have spoken aloud. Thomas, 17, had become in practical terms Grant's partner in the cattle operation. Not the legal partner yet, but the working partner, the one who knew the herd and the range and the economics of it with a thoroughness that Grant acknowledged openly, and that Thomas carried with the serious steadiness he had always carried everything. Grant had told Georgia one evening that Thomas was better with cattle than he was himself, and Georgia had said she thought Grant was being modest, and Grant had said no. He had thought about it carefully, and he was not, and the look on his face had been such pure, uncomplicated pride that she had felt it in her own chest like a struck bell. On a September evening in 1896, 13 years after their wedding, and 16 years after Georgia had first driven her sleigh down Grant's road with a question and a borrowed need, they sat on the porch again in their chairs. The sky was doing the September thing, the particular richness of the September sky in Wyoming before the cold came in and flattened everything. The air smelled of grass and distance and the specific indefinable smell of the high plains in autumn. Thomas was inside. Ruth was inside. William was inside. James was in Laramie. The house behind them was full of the sounds of the evening voices, the movement of people who lived in a space and inhabited it, the particular music of a house with children in it, which was never entirely quiet, and which Georgia had come to understand was the sound of everything she had wanted and not known how to name before she had it. Grant said, "Georgia." "Yes," she said, "I'm going to say something that I should have said more often." "What is it?" He was looking at the sky. He turned and looked at her. The September light was doing something generous with his face, with the gray eyes she had looked into on a February morning 13 years ago when he had said keep it and said more, and she had gone inside and everything had changed. "I love you," he said. "I love you entirely. I love who you were when you drove your sleigh through the snow with your jaw set and your boy beside you, and I love who you are now, and I love everything in between and everything after. I should say that out loud more than I do." Georgia looked at him for a long time. She thought about December of 1882, the wolves at the chicken coop and the sleigh and the 3 miles of snow. She thought about the rifle on the hook and the coffee in his kitchen and the February morning she had walked back with the rifle, and he had told her to keep it and said more. She thought about the flower in his shirt pocket and the kiss on the porch and the September day and the white church and the births of 4 children and the winters and the summers and the ordinary, extraordinary texture of the 13 years they had made together. She said, "I know you love me. I have always known it. You have been saying it in everything except words from the very beginning." "I know," he said, "but I want to say it in the words too." "Then say it often," she said. "I will. And I love you," she said, "entirely the same way." He reached over and took her hand, his hand covering hers the way it had covered hers on that winter evening when she had told him she felt full, when she had found the word for what this was. The sky went on being magnificent above them. The cattle were settled. The children were inside. The rifle hung on the hook by the door. Georgia Carson sat on her porch in September in the state of Wyoming with her husband's hand over hers, and the life they had built spread out around her in every direction she could see. And she thought, with the clarity she brought to every true and important thing she had ever known, that she had been right in February of 1883 when she had gone inside. She had always been right about the things that mattered. The rifle stayed where it was. It would stay there for the rest of their long lives. Through Thomas's marriage to a woman named Claire, who came from Colorado, and fit into the family with the ease of someone who had been expected. through James's return from Laramie with a degree and an enthusiasm for the land that surprised them all and contradicted his earlier bookishness in the best possible way. Through Ruth's formidable adolescence and her equally formidable young womanhood and her announcement that she intended to study nursing, which Georgia supported with everything she had, because she had not raised a daughter with gray eyes and a spine of iron to tell her what she could not do. Through William's growth from furious newborn to gentle-natured boy to steady young man with his mother's stubbornness and his father's patience in an improbable and effective combination. The ranch went on. The sky went on. The seasons moved through their rotations, each one a repetition and each one new. Grant Carson and Georgia Carson sat on their porch in the good seasons, and by their fire in the hard ones, and built the years together in the way that two people build years when they have both been alone enough to know what it means to not be alone, and are grateful for it every day. And the rifle hung on the hook by the door, the Winchester she had borrowed in a hard winter, the rifle he had told her to keep, the one she had walked 3 miles through mud and ice to return, and had walked home still carrying because he had said something more than keep it, had said without saying that she was worth keeping, that what she carried, her grief and her pride and her stubborn, capable heart, was not a burden he was burdened by but a thing he wanted close. She had understood in the end. She had gone inside. And all the rest of it, the children and the seasons and the long September evenings and the warmth of a hand covering a hand in the firelight, all of it had been the kept rifle too. All of it had been what he said when he said more. All of it had been the answer to a question she had asked one December morning without quite knowing she was asking it. Is there still something here for me? Is there still something worth coming in for? Yes, he had said, in the February kitchen with his coffee and his still gray eyes and his voice that was always level because the feeling underneath it was so deep it needed a lid. Yes. Come in. Keep the rifle. Keep yourself. Let me keep you close. She had. And the world had been warmer for it than she had known to ask.